In this demo, we will learn how to create a new point of interest for a city. We know from the previous module, the HTTP method to use for that is POST. The data, and thus the corresponding models of what we send to the API, isn't necessarily the same as what we get back from an API, or what is stored in the data store. The further we get along in the course, the more this will shine through. But at this moment, when creating a resource, it already starts to become obvious. We've got a point of interest DTO here, currently used by our in-memory data store and also returned when getting a point of interest. But looking at this point of interest DTO class, it's easy to see why we should not use this for our post. This class has an ID value. That ID, that's something the server, which is our API, is responsible for. It's not something to be chosen by the consumer of the API, at least not in our design. With that in mind, we know that the ID should not be part of the DTO used for creation. So let's add a new class. We name it Point of Interest for Creation DTO, and it contains a name and a description, no ID. Now, there are systems where the consumer is responsible for choosing the ID, so it is a valid use case, and it would lead to the Point of Interest DTO and Point of Interest for Creation DTO to contain the exact same fields. But even in those cases, I would suggest to keep these separate. It leads to a model that's more in line with the API functionality, making change or refactoring afterwards easier. Also, when validation comes into play, you might want validation on input, but that's not necessarily the same validation, if at all, that's needed on the output. So the rule is use a separate DTO for creating, updating, and returning resources. Let's open our points of interest controller. We'll want to add a new action here. Create point of interest. We decorate it with the HTTP POST attribute. A POST request returns the created resource in the response, so we return an action result of type point of interest DTO. The route template contains the city ID first. This part of the template is defined at level of the route attribute. It's followed by points of interest. So what we need to do is accept the city ID parameter. Then we need to be able to get the content of the request message. This request body will contain the point of interest data which we want to deserialize to a point of interest for creation DTO. So that becomes our second parameter. This is a complex type. So as we're using the API controller attribute, we do not need to add an additional from body annotation. If you want to do this, you can, but it's not necessary. The content will be assumed to come from the request body. There's a few things that can go wrong with POST requests, things we'll have to check for. The consumer might send a request to a resource URI that doesn't exist. That means the consumer is trying to add a point of interest to an non-existing city. So we check for that and return not found if the city doesn't exist. If the city exists, we can add the new point of interest. But we need to calculate the ID of the new point of interest. For now, we'll just calculate the highest ID of all points of interest and add 1 to it. This is just temporary. We'll improve on this later on. The second issue is that our data store currently works on point of interest DTO, not on point of interest for creation DTO. And point of interest for creation DTO, that's the type that the request body is deserialized to. So we have to map that to a point of interest DTO. That's not hard to do. We just new up a point of interest DTO and copy over the name and description. As an ID, we take the previously calculated max point of interest ID and add 1. Finally, we add a final point of interest to the city's points of interest collection. Now, as you might notice, this is quite cumbersome. Mapping can easily lead to errors. And running through all the cities and their points of interest just to get an ID, that's not ideal either. performance-wise on one hand, and on the other hand, this code does not take possible errors when multiple consumers try to get an ID at almost the same time into account. But just as with most things in this course, we start somewhere and we keep on improving on what we learn throughout the course. For now, this will do. Lastly, we need to return something. For post, when all goes well, the advised response is 201 created. Helper methods exist on the controller base. The one we want is created at route. This one allows us to return a response with a location header. That location header will contain the URI where the newly created point of interest can be found. So, what would this have to refer to? Well, if we scroll up a bit, we see that we've got an action here to get one specific point of interest. That's the one it has to refer to. We can give it a name, so we can easily refer to it when calling into created at route. Let's name it getPointOfInterest. Back to our createPointOfInterest method. And in created at route, we now pass through the name we just gave to the route. The getPointOfInterest route template needs a city ID and the ID of our point of interest. For that, we pass through an anonymous type with those values. With this information, the correct URI can be calculated. We also pass in the newly created point of interest, which will end up in the response body. And that should do it. Let's save this and let's give this a try. We're back in Postman. In the collection, you'll find a post request to create a point of interest. We want to send that post request to API, cities, the city ID, and points of interest. The city with ID 3 is Paris. So let's add a point of interest to that. The point of interest we want to add is defined in the request body. In Paris there's a very nice cemetery named Père Lachaise, which is where Jim Morrison and Oscar Wilde are buried. Jim's grave is small, a bit run down even, but nice in its way. And Oscar actually has a big tomb full of lipstick of all the people who come there and kiss the tomb. Definitely worth a visit. So each self-respecting city info API about Paris should contain this. We pass it in as JSON, but we need to tell this to our API somehow so it knows how to deserialize this. That is what the content type header is for. In our case, with a value of application JSON. In the previous module, we talked about input and output formatters. Well, this tells the framework that it should use the JSON input formatter to deserialize the request body. Let's send this. And we get back a 201 created status code with the newly created point of interest in the response body. If we have a look at the headers, we find a location header. The value of the location header is the location of the point of interest. Let's navigate to that. So we send a GET request to this newly created point of interest, and we indeed get back Père Lachaise. When creating resources, one of the things you'll want to do is validating input. Let's cover that next.